It is indeed a pleasure this morning to call to order this symposium entitled Cost and Consequences of Hidden Hunger, a symposium in honor of Nevin Scrimshaw, the 1991 World Food Prize laureate. First, to bring a welcome from Iowa State University, I'm very pleased to recognize Martin Jischke, the university's newly installed 13th president. Dr. Jischke.
Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to Iowa State University. It is a great honor for those of us at the university to be part of the World Food Prize. Yesterday I had the honor and privilege of seeing the prize awarded to Dr. Nevin Scrimshaw. On behalf of Iowa State, I want to offer our heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Scrimshaw at this honor and our deepest appreciation for his contributions to tackling the world's problems related to nutrition. It is fitting that the World Food Prize has found a home here in Iowa. As a prize to honor those who help feed the world's people, it finds a home in a state whose farmers have been feeding the world's people for hundreds of years. As a prize to honor those who feed the world's people, it finds a home in a state with a land-grant university that has continuously provided the world with educated persons as well as abundant and high-quality food products. And as a prize to honor those who feed the world's people, it finds a home in a state which is a food supplier to the world. There's an old proverb that goes, "A task without a vision is a drudgery. A vision without a task is a dream. A task with a vision is victory." Those who have won the World Food Prize have been blessed with both vision and perseverance. For scientific exploration, as many of you know, is more a question of dogged determination than it is flashes of insight. The perseverance of the prize winners has had results all over the world. There is better health in Central America. We have had a six-fold increase in potato production in Mexico, a revolution in milk and grain production in India, and a tripling of rice yields in Asia. These winners, these scientists, because they had vision, persevered and turned their vision into reality and into victory, and you will see yet another victory in the talk today. The World Food Prize was created because of the vision of one man, Norman Borlaug of Iowa. The World Food Prize remains a worthy endeavor because of the vision of people such as these, people seeking to solve the world's problems. The World Food Prize finds its home in Iowa because of the vision of another Iowan, John Ruan. On behalf of all Iowans and all of us at Iowa State, I want to personally and publicly thank John Ruan for his vision and his generosity in bringing this prize to Iowa. John, thank you. We at Iowa State are indeed very proud to share that vision and to share in making the vision a reality. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Jischke. We are indeed honored that John Ruan, who is chairman of the World Food Prize Foundation, is with us this morning, here to bring greetings on behalf of that foundation. Mr. Ruan.
Thank you, and good morning. On behalf of the World Food Prize Foundation, I join with Dr. Jischke in welcoming you to this symposium. Today's symposium has attracted several hundred scientists, educators, and others whose lives focus on the importance of food for human and social development. Being a native Iowan, whenever I hear the word food, my thoughts turn to this great state where Iowa is agriculture and producers work hard to help feed a hungry world. I think about what Iowa means to a hungry world in terms of education. The teaching of agricultural technology by this great land-grant institution, Iowa State University. That's why when we had the opportunity to do so, it just seemed natural to bring the sponsorship and the administration of the World Food Prize to Iowa. This year is our first full year of prize sponsorship. We're very excited that Dr. Nevin S. Scrimshaw is the first World Food Prize laureate selected under our watch. His career and lifelong dedication to solving problems of hunger and malnutrition exemplify all of the things the World Food Prize stands for. The prize emphasizes the importance of nutritious and sustainable food supply for all people. By honoring those who have worked successfully toward this goal, the World Food Prize calls attention to what has been done to improve the world food supply and to what can be accomplished in the future. And that brings us to today's symposium. I am pleased that so many have come here today from near and far to share ideas and thoughts on how to solve the hunger problem, including the costs and consequences of hidden hunger. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ruan. 2 items of business before we get started on today's proceedings. First, continuing education units are being offered for dietetics and nursing and perhaps 1 or 2 other sorts. Please consult tables in the area behind the auditorium if you wish to sign up for those continuing education units. Second, in your packets are cards. We would like you to use those cards in order to have a discussion with Dr. Scrimshaw at the end of his address this morning. So there will be a few minutes after Nevin has completed his remarks for people to pass through the aisles to collect your cards. And then those cards will be used as a basis for a discussion with Dr. Scrimshaw for a few moments before our break. So please get the cards out now and use them as the questions or comments occur to you throughout his talk, and we will gather them immediately at the end for use in the discussion. Thanks. The honor of introducing our laureate and keynote speaker today goes to one of Dr. Scrimshaw's longtime colleagues and friends, Dr. Vernon Young. Dr. Young is himself an internationally acclaimed scientist who has added significantly to our understanding of human nutrient requirements and ways to assess those requirements. He is a native of Wales who was educated first at Reading in England, a sojourn through Cambridge, and then who wound up at the University of California at Davis, another of our major land-grant universities, where he was awarded a PhD. Dr. Young has been associated with MIT since the early 1960s, where he credits Dr. Scrimshaw with the guidance that helped Dr. Young achieve recognition as one of the United States' most productive nutritional biochemists. He's also known as an excellent communicator of the results of nutritional science. In 1973, Dr. Young was awarded the Meade Johnson Award of the American Institute of Nutrition, the so-called Young Investigators Award for outstanding research in nutrition. In 1982, he was the recipient of the Institute's Borden Award in Nutrition, and recently has served as president of the American Institute of Nutrition. Dr. Young is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. From these highlights of his accomplishments, we can clearly see that he was well tutored by Dr. Scrimshaw. Nevin's characteristics of hard work, coupled with clear vision, are manifest in Vernon as well. His colleagues worry that he may work too hard for his own good. But his clear vision is of concern only to those who find themselves on the opposite side of the argument. Nevin, Vernon isn't quite perfect yet. There is some polishing you yet need to do. Vernon has the gift of language that we tend to associate with the bardic tradition of Welsh literature, the sharp wit that seems somehow to be honed in the British Isles, and at times I suspect there's a bit of the Irish in him, for he frequently exhibits the gift of blarney. These traits have been known to get him into more than a bit of trouble. Nonetheless, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce at this time Dr. Vernon Young, a colleague whom I admire and like a lot. Dr. Young.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Pat. And as you were making that beautiful introduction, I was reminded of a quote attributable to Mark Twain, who, on a visit to London some many years ago, sent a cable to the Associated Press in New York, and the cable read, "The news of my death is greatly exaggerated." President Jiski, Mr. Ruan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege to serve as this morning's chairman, or the chairman of this morning's series of what potentially is a series of exciting presentations. And my first very pleasant duty is to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Nevin Scrimshaw, the 1991 World Food Prize laureate, and my, as Pat has indicated, long-term mentor at MIT. Currently, Professor Scrimshaw is Professor Emeritus at MIT and Director of the Food, Nutrition, Human and Social Development Program of the United Nations University. Dr. Scrimshaw is a distinguished, no, I should correct myself, he is the most distinguished international nutritionist who has made a series of remarkable contributions throughout his distinguished career, but in the area of nutrition, both in terms of its academic underpinning and in reference to the application and transfer of nutrition knowledge for the good of especially less privileged populations worldwide. Nevin's introduction to the field of nutrition began quite a few years ago during his training at Rochester and in Panama, where he became involved in studies that related to nutrition and pregnancy. Shortly thereafter, he became the founding director of the Institute of Nutrition of Central America and Panama, and developed that institution into one that was preeminent in the field of nutrition, both in the context of research and in relation to the resolution of major nutrition and public health problems in the region. Dr. Scrimshaw became involved in studies of endemic goiter and developed means for the iodization of salt, and this resulted in a major reduction and the elimination in certain areas of this tragic problem. Dr. Scrimshaw's work on the clinical aspects of protein deficiency disease are known to all of us, and he was responsible for developing low-cost vegetable protein weaning mixtures, which in Caparina became the prototype for similar developments worldwide. Nevin has been responsible for identifying and heightening our awareness of the significance of the interaction between nutrition and infection, particularly in the context of the etiology of one form of protein energy malnutrition, namely kwashiorkor. He has been concerned with and made major contributions to the area of iron nutriture, iron deficiency disease, and its functional consequences. One could, of course, actually go on and on, highlighting his important and seminal contributions. He established in the 1960s a major department of nutrition and food science at MIT, and actually Nevin continues to serve as an institution builder. His involvement in the international nutrition community is legend. In the mid-1970s, he established the World Hunger Program of the United Nations University. As is indicated in the material before you, Nevin has received numerous awards, multiple honorary degrees. He is a member of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But despite all of this, Nevin remains a wonderful, dedicated, and beautiful individual. And certainly, Nevin, you're a mentor for which there could be no equal. It is a privilege, Nevin, to call upon you to deliver your keynote address entitled Human and Social Significance of Hidden Hunger. Nevin Scrimshaw.
President Diskey, Dean Swan, Mr. Rawan, Professor Young, colleagues, friends. First, thank you, Pat, and especially you, Vernon, for your very kind, generous words. Before beginning, I would also like to repeat my appreciation for the vision of Mr. John Rawan in setting up the World Food Prize Foundation. It is a magnificent contribution to encouraging the work toward the conquest of hunger worldwide. The World Food Prize this year has been given for the first time to someone whose life has been devoted to the processing, distribution, and consumption of food rather than its primary production. Adequate food production for a growing world population depends on the continuing success of agricultural research and extension. But the conquest of hunger and malnutrition requires additional links in the food chain. These include post-harvest food conservation and storage, processing and distribution, and finally, consumption. Human need cannot be met, and human demand is not effective unless people can consume an adequate diet. Famines and the hunger of refugees periodically affect hundreds of thousands and even millions of people for limited periods of time. The silent emergency of hidden hunger chronically and often permanently damages hundreds of millions of individuals. I will try to convey to you the magnitude and the consequences of the various kinds of hidden hunger that still devastate such a large proportion of the world's population. The conquest of hidden hunger is essential to the human future. With modern communications, almost everyone in the Western world is aware of the ravages of famine. Civil war and government oppression create refugee populations that furnish the news media with graphic pictures and heart-rending descriptions of dying children and wasted adults. The developed world tries to respond to the crisis, but only after great suffering has occurred. Then the developed world relaxes until the next crisis. Improved agricultural production can do very little for this kind of hunger because it is rooted in government cruelty, disinterest, corruption, and aggression. While drought may sometimes be an exacerbating factor, it is rarely famine's primary cause. We have seen most recently in Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Iraq, that it is government actions that result in desperate refugees. International assistance cannot eliminate hunger of this kind without changes in national policy. It is hidden hunger that is responsible for most of the excessive mortality, the ill health affecting developing country populations, and for permanent impairment of physical capacity and cognitive performance. It is a sad fact that as shameful and tragic as is the occurrence of famine in today's world, its economic, social, and individual significance pales beside the tragedy of hidden hunger that affects a majority of the populations of most developing countries. The principal focus of this presentation, therefore, will be on the extent to which most of the hunger that is damaging the survival, development, and welfare of underprivileged populations is unrecognized, because even where there are clinical symptoms, they're not associated with food. This talk will emphasize that the solution of hidden hunger requires the efforts of many different disciplines, including nutrition and food science, and the social and political sciences, as well as agricultural and fisheries. Hunger, both overt and hidden, is largely the result of government policies. Overcoming hunger requires the implementation of policies that facilitate food production and increase social equity, improve nutrition and health, and reduce the burden of poverty. Foreign aid can do little to alleviate hidden hunger in a country without the active cooperation of the government. The basic human rights are food, shelter, education, and opportunity for the future. And the most fundamental and urgent of these is food. International, bilateral, and voluntary agencies can and should be influential in promoting political changes that favor these basic human rights. However, ultimately, it will be the policies that governments adopt that will determine the security with which their populations can achieve these basic rights, including the right to food. Now, turning to chronic undernutrition in adults, I'll first describe how the adaptive behavior necessary to survive chronic dietary energy deficiency can have serious social and economic consequences. The best available estimates of the dietary intakes of the populations of most developing countries indicate that they are significantly lower than the estimated requirements for their occupational patterns and lifestyles. The explanation is that in order to survive, individuals must reduce their physical activity. Within limits, this is a biologically successful adaptation, but its social and economic consequences can be severe. In Central America, as in many other developing regions, workers are often paid by the task rather than by the hour, because there is so much variation in the work that they can accomplish in a given period of time. When all of their limited discretionary energy must be used for occupational work, there's nothing left over for household improvement, entrepreneurship, and the community activities upon which the development process depends. Such individuals are not lazy, as is so often thought, but forced into inactivity in order to survive inadequate dietary energy intakes, a vicious circle in which they are trapped. It is adapt in this manner or die For example, Viteri and Tarun at INCAP have observed that plantation workers walked home slowly from field work and then remained sedentary for the rest of the day and slept long hours. When supplementary feeding was introduced, their behavior changed. They worked faster, walked home more rapidly, and had energy for village activities. In the Philippines, Patricia de Guzman at the Food and Nutrition Research Institute found that when poor families received supplementary food, more of their day was spent in moderate activities rather than sedentary ones. Moreover, for some activities, they were able to work harder per unit of time. For road workers in Kenya, supplementation resulted in a 12% increase in daily productivity. If the food energy available is less than can be compensated for by reduced physical activity, then lean body mass is lost as well. Loss of body cell mass lowers overall energy requirements and may permit a new equilibrium. In tropical developing countries, such a loss is often observed seasonally, as illustrated by the first slide for Ethiopia. There are many sophisticated ways of measuring lean body mass. Well, can you focus it, please? This simply shows the seasonal changes. The simple relationship shown in the next slide of weight in kilograms divided by the square of height in meters provides good results. The next slide classifies the degree of undernutrition as judged by lean body mass. By this criterion of undernutrition, the damaging consequences are evident. The next slide shows the relationship of chronic undernutrition to mortality in Indian men. The next slide shows the adverse impact of low, I'm going to use the term BMI for body mass index, low BMI of the mothers in India on birth weight. The next slide indicates the relationship found in Bangladesh between the father's BMI and the percent of time not working due to illness. Children are very susceptible to the effects of chronic energy deficiency because their requirements per unit of body weight are higher. INCAP researchers Fernando Viteri and Benny Tarun observed the results of reducing the dietary energy intake by 10% for preschool children in a convalescent home. These children were growing well on an ad libitum diet with adequate protein. Over the following month, there was a decrease in their activity that compensated for the reduced energy, and they continued to grow as before. When energy intake was reduced another 10% while maintaining the same amount of dietary protein, a further reduction in activity was not sufficient and growth was affected. These observations, carried out under controlled conditions, reveal the impact of chronic energy deficiency on millions of children. The children were fortunate because they were promptly restored to a good ad libitum diet and quickly made up their growth loss and increased their activity. Reduced activity of children, as long as growth is not affected, might seem to be of little consequence, but it is the young child's interaction with the environment, including family members, that provides the stimuli for normal cognitive development. This reduced interaction with undernutrition may explain the observation of Joaquin Cravioto in rural Mexico many years ago. The children in the lowest quartile of weight for age performed less well on tests of intersensory perception than those in the highest quartile. However, no differences were found among the weight for age quartiles of privileged urban children. The next slide from INCAP shows the strong relationship between stunting and literacy test means. It is even more serious that coming generations will continue to be stunted as long as new generations of children are undernourished. The causes of chronic growth retardation of preschool children resulting in chronic stunting are more complex than energy deficiency alone. Protein and micronutrients are also involved. In addition, the high frequency of diarrheal and respiratory infections can result in protein energy deficiency even when the diet would otherwise be adequate. Moreover, the high frequency and severity of infectious diseases among malnourished children in developing countries is due in large part to reduced resistance to infection resulting from malnutrition. Most young children in the lower socioeconomic groups of underdeveloped countries become stunted during the weaning period, and these children are likely to remain stunted when they enter school. They end up as stunted adults with reduced work capacity, as has been shown in many different countries, including Brazil, Colombia, Ethiopia, Guatemala, India, and Sudan. The effects of protein energy malnutrition in early childhood go far beyond physical stunting. During 1969 to 1977, an INCAP study in 2 Guatemalan villages provided incaparina, a highly nutritious vegetable mixture, to pregnant mothers and to their children during and after weaning for the first 3 years after birth. Their performance was compared with the children of 2 comparable villages in which only a low-calorie flavored beverage was given to mothers and children. Concurrently, a somewhat similar study was underway in a rural Mexican village led by Adolfo Chavez of the National Institute of Nutrition. In both studies, the supplemented children grew better, had fewer infections, were more physically active, and performed better on behavioral tests than did the controls. The studies ended, and the results were published. 14 years later, the same investigators were able to return and re-examine most of the children, now adolescents and young adults, who had participated in the original programs. The results have been striking and will be described further by Dr. Pollitt, I'm sure. Despite no further interventions, the Guatemalan children who had received the incaparina maintained their height advantage and performed in a superior manner on the Central American Intelligence Test and appropriate achievement tests when the groups were compared for the same number of school years. However, the incaparina group also completed more years of school, so that the overall differences between the two in test performance were even more striking. And I learned 2 weeks ago that very similar results have now been obtained in the Mexican study. Thus, malnutrition at an early age affects not only the physical performance of the adult, but also the intellectual and social performance, a finding of tremendous importance for the future of developing countries and also for underprivileged children in the United States and other industrialized countries. When genetic potential is reduced by undernutrition and associated factors, small is beautiful is a pernicious falsehood. Prevalence of undernutrition in children and adults. What proportion of the world's population lives all or part of their lives with chronic energy deficiency? If average dietary energy intake figures are compared with estimated energy requirements, the problem is seriously underestimated. Because, as the this slide indicates, upper income groups consume and waste more calories than they need, leaving disproportionately less for the poorer groups. And this is illustrated for Africa in this slide from Reutlinger and Solowski of the World Bank. Taking this factor into account, this slide shows a World Bank figure of 730 million persons in 1980. There are many more today. The FAO estimate was 475 million for 1989 and 512 million persons in 1985. However, FAO was using a more stringent criterion and that many of us feel to be inappropriate. The next slide shows that 1.4 times basal metabolic rate, that is 40% above basal metabolic rate, allows for sedentary survival, but not for the activity necessary for the maintenance of cardiovascular fitness or for acquiring food. FAO even calculated and published a figure for persons consuming 1.2 times BMR in case it should be demonstrated that individuals could adapt to this low figure, a triumph of politics over science. It should be emphasized also that estimates of food availability, food intake, and energy requirements are each notoriously unreliable. The most convenient basis for judging the prevalence of protein-calorie malnutrition in young children is retardation in physical growth. By this criterion, data compiled by the UN Subcommittee on Nutrition and the World Health Organization show that from 1/3 to 2/3 of developing country children show some degree of growth retardation. The first UN report on the world nutrition situation in 1987 used a criterion of 2 standard deviations below the mean for well-nourished children. By this standard, the proportion of underweight children varied from 25% in Africa to 70% in South Asia. Although percentages are decreasing in most regions, the absolute number of children retarded in weight and height continues to increase. INCAP finds that 95% of rural Guatemalan women are stunted. The next slide shows the difference at age 7 of children who have received a supplement of encaparina during the first 3 years of life. The middle figure, the right-hand figure unsupplemented, and the left that of a well-nourished U.S. child. Philip James, the director of the Rowett Research Institute in Aberdeen, to whom I am indebted for a number of these slides, has suggested that lean body mass, classified as shown in a previous slide, is a more precise measure of undernutrition. It should be very clear that this classification includes only those individuals who have had to adjust biologically, and not the large number of additional persons who have adapted by restricting their physical activity sufficiently to conserve lean body mass. Nevertheless, when applied to population data, the extent of undernutrition in developing countries, as judged only by low body mass index, is still dramatic. 63% of the population of Ethiopia falls into one of the grades of undernutrition. And in this slide, it's shown to be true for 50% of individuals in 10 states in India. Whichever criterion is chosen for the prevalence of undernutrition, a large proportion of the populations of most developing countries is affected. Moreover, the situation is worsening in many countries under the pressure of economic adjustments imposed on those with large foreign debts. The next slide shows the reduction. This shows the increase in preschool mortality due to malnutrition in Mexico from 1980 to 1988 under the pressures of economic adjustment. This shows the downward trend in average caloric intakes per capita in Mexico from 1975 to 1989. And this shows that even Venezuela, a country with once robust economy, has experienced a 20% drop in the caloric intake per capita in a poor district of Caracas. Similar decreases have occurred in a number of other countries in Latin America and Africa. Now, I'd like to comment on the importance of dietary protein. It is frequently stated that if individuals and populations obtain sufficient calories from their usual diets, protein adequacy is assured. This generally true statement often leads to a false conclusions. All societies which have survived have found a way to supplement the protein of a cereal or root staple with other foods that sufficiently improve the quality and quantity of protein in their usual diet. However, when societies or individuals, for economic reasons or otherwise, are not able to obtain the complementary protein sources on which an adequate diet depends, a high morbidity and mortality, even extinction, ensues. Wherever individuals cannot obtain their usual diets, whether it be due to poverty, war, civil disturbance, or natural disaster, attention to dietary protein becomes crucial. Some of the confusion arises from a suggested protein allowance for adults proposed by the 1973 FAO-WHO expert group on protein energy requirements. It was much lower than in the past, while leaving energy recommendations unchanged. This estimate led to a reevaluation of developing country diets and the conclusion that they were limiting in protein, not energy. Extensive multi-country research sponsored by the United Nations University established that this figure was too low and needed to be increased by approximately 1/3, a correction that was made in the report of the next expert group meeting published in 1985, the FAO-WHO-UNU expert group. Diarrheal, respiratory, and other infections are exceedingly common among poorly nourished children because their resistance to infection is weakened by poor nutrition and also because they live in an unhealthy and contaminated environment. As shown in this slide, this susceptibility can be reversed by supplementation. The white bars show the drop in infectious disease morbidity after 6 months and up to 36 months in those children who received a nutritious supplement. In any individual, an episode of infection worsens nutritional status, but this is of no consequence if the individual is well nourished and the diet during convalescence is adequate for rapid recovery. Children whose nutritional status is marginal will be progressively depleted by repeated infections unless their diet allows for catch-up. Control of these infections is a nutritional intervention. I will now turn to the damage done by micronutrient deficiencies of iron, iodine, and vitamin A. Fortunately, the classical vitamin deficiency diseases of beriberi due to thiamine deficiency, pellagra due to niacin and tryptophan deficiency, and scurvy due to vitamin C deficiency have largely disappeared as public health problems, although they are being seen again in refugee populations in Asia and Africa. Iron deficiency is the most widespread nutritional problem in the world today. Long before its cause was known, the pallor of anemia was associated with weakness and tiredness. It is now recognized that even mild to moderate iron deficiency without anemia has adverse functional consequences. The earliest functions to be affected by iron deficiency are those of brain enzymes involved in cognition and behavior. In the United States, iron supplementation has been shown to improve the cognitive performance of iron-deficient infants, preschool children, and adolescents. An adverse effect of iron deficiency has been confirmed by studies in infants in Chile, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Indonesia, and in school children in Egypt, India, Indonesia, and Thailand. These adverse effects have proved not to be reversible if the dietary deficiency is moderate to severe. Dr. Pollitt, who has been responsible for a considerable proportion of these studies, will describe them in greater detail. But I will mention an article in the September 5th issue of the New England Journal of Medicine by Losoff and co-workers, following up her earlier study in Costa Rica. They found that children who had moderately severe anemia as infants had lower test scores of mental and other functioning at school entry than the rest of the children, even when controlled for a comprehensive set of socioeconomic factors. The mechanisms by which iron deficiency impairs learning and behavior, both reversible and non-reversible, are probably multiple, and the duration of the effect related to the age of onset. Nevertheless, it is now firmly established that iron deficiency can impair cognitive performance at all stages of life, and that when it occurs in infants and young children, its effects may not be reversible. Next to suffer from iron deficiency are cells of the immune system. A number of antimicrobial systems within the neutrophil are adversely affected by iron deficiency. One is the capacity of the phagocytic cell to kill ingested microorganisms by the so-called respiratory burst. Hemoglobin status is found to be directly related to bactericidal activity of leukocytes, both in vitro and in vivo. Chandra and co-workers have also demonstrated in Indian children that iron deficiency decreases the ability of lymphocytes to replicate when stimulated by a mitogen. There is extensive evidence from India for a direct relationship between iron status and the concentration of cells responsible for cell-mediated immunity. The skin test response to common antigens indicates the development of immunity, and in studies of iron-deficient children in India and Kenya, this response has been found to be reduced. In Alaskan Native children, iron deficiency has been reported to be associated with increased diarrheal and respiratory disease, and meningitis was observed to be fatal only in anemic children. The study of Basta and co-workers in Indonesia found that greater morbidity from infection among the anemic rubber tappers decreased after iron supplementation. In both our Egyptian and Indonesian field studies, a decrease in diarrheal and respiratory disease was observed in the groups receiving iron supplementation. Work capacity and productivity. The next slide from the work of Verteri in Guatemala shows a linear relationship between hemoglobin status and Harvard STEP test performance, a measure of physical capacity used here with adult plantation workers. When the individuals with low hemoglobin were supplemented with iron, their performance improved markedly. In Indonesia, Samir Basta and co-workers found similar differences in Harvard STEP test scores between anemic and non-anemic road construction workers and rubber tappers. Both groups improved their performance when they were given iron for 30 to 60 days. Among male tea pickers in Sri Lanka, the results were similar. In Colombia, Kenya, and Sri Lanka, treadmill performance of agricultural workers was proportional to plasma hemoglobin. The question remains as to whether these observed differences in physical capacity affect productivity. Basta and his group showed a strong correlation between hemoglobin status, Harvard STEP test performance, and the take-home pay of Indonesian rubber tappers. Tappers given iron supplementation for 60 days increased their take-home pay by more than 30%. Even among weeders who were not paid on an incentive basis, more area was weeded by those who were not anemic, and their output also increased with the ones who were anemic. Their output also increased with supplementation. In a subsequent study in Indonesia by Husseini and co-workers, there was a direct relationship between hemoglobin and the amount of tea picked. Output and take-home pay increased 25% after iron supplementation for 30 to 60 days. The daily productivity of anemic male tea pickers in Sri Lanka increased more than 20% after iron supplementation for 1 month. Agricultural productivity also increased in Indian women and Colombian male agricultural workers given iron supplementation. There are additional adverse consequences of iron deficiency on the childbearing woman. Maternal mortality, prenatal and perinatal infant loss, and prematurity are significantly increased. Compared to normal mothers, favorable pregnancy outcomes are 30 to 45% less effective in anemic mothers. And their infants have less than 1/2 the iron reserves. Such infants are at great risk of morbidity and mortality during infancy. Iron deficiency during pregnancy leads to low birth weight infants who exhaust their iron stores at an earlier age. They then require more iron than supplied by breast milk at an earlier age than breastfed infants of normal birth weight. Now, what about prevalence? The next slide shows the distribution of iron deficiency as reported by WHO. More than 40% of the populations of Africa and Asia are anemic. WHO data by region gives an overall anemia rate of 26% for men and 42% for women. In the next slide, children ages 0 to 4 have an anemia prevalence of 51%, while school-age children have an anemia prevalence of 46%. A recent report from India gives an anemia prevalence of 60 to 80% for pregnant women. The corresponding figures for Indonesia is 69%. 58% of Brazilian infants are found to be anemic, and then using biochemical measures of iron deficiency, 96% are iron deficient. And in all cases, the number who are iron deficient is 50 to 100% greater than the number who are anemic. Iron deficiency affects substantial numbers of persons in the United States. If iron deficiency rather than anemia is the criterion, 1/3 of premenopausal women in the United States fall into this category, with minority groups more heavily affected. Using data from the NHANES 2 for 1976 to 1980, and this is the latest we have, the Life Sciences Research Office documents an overall 7% prevalence of actual anemia in women 15 to 44 years of age, but with the highest burden in minority and poverty groups. For example, the Haines figure for the percentage of persons with 2 or 3 abnormal iron status indicators was 12% for white and 31% for black adolescents 15 to 19 years of age. Draw your own conclusions about the effect on school performance. Vitamin A is another critical micronutrient. It is converted directly into the visual pigment that is essential for low light vision. An early sign of vitamin A deficiency is night blindness. Vitamin A deficiency also causes the epithelium of the conjunctiva and cornea to be particularly susceptible to lesions. The eye becomes dry and frothy, lesions appear on the conjunctiva, and as the deficiency progresses, the cornea becomes eroded, the iris prolapse, the lens is extruded, and a corneal scar develops, resulting in blindness. In the last 3 years, 4 studies have reported dramatic increases in mortality of children 0 to 5 years of age that have been given supplementary vitamin A for 12 months. And these studies, Dr. Underwood will discuss in much greater detail. WHO estimates that about 50 million children in the world suffer from vitamin A deficiency, although this varies greatly among regions and countries, as the next slide shows. Vitamin A deficiency is recognized as a public health problem in 37 countries. Subclinical deficiency undoubtedly affects many more. Iodine deficiency. Until recently, iodine deficiency was identified only with a compensatory swelling of the thyroid gland known as endemic goiter, and with cretinism, a manifestation of the child with severe manifestation in the child of severe iron deficiency during pregnancy. Here, goiters in Nepal, goiters in Santa Maria de Jesus, a highland Guatemalan village. The typical cretin has profound mental deficiency, a characteristic appearance, a shuffling gait, shortened stature, spastic dysplasia, and is usually deaf and mute. The consequences of iron deficiency are listed in this slide. It is now recognized that cases of cretinism, although few in number, indicate a much larger number of persons who do not have any of the classical signs of cretinism. But their linear growth, intellectual capacity, and neurological functions are impaired in varying degrees. Endemic goiter rates in school children are the most convenient indicator of iron deficiency. Above 10%, they indicate a significant public health problem. Endemic goiter is global in distribution wherever populations depend on local food supplies grown on iodine-poor soil. It occurs in regions that have been glaciated, mountainous areas, and ones with heavy rainfall. Except where iodinated salt has been introduced, goiter is still prevalent along the Andean chain of mountains, across Central Africa and the Asian subcontinent, and the entire length of the Himalayan mountain chain, with large pockets of severe disease in Burma, Vietnam, Indonesia, and New Guinea. Iodine deficiency disorders are significant in at least 90 countries. About 1 billion persons of all ages are considered to be at risk from iodine deficiency, and cases of endemic goiter are estimated at 200 to 300 million. About 20 million of these are believed to experience some degree of mental retardation or other neurological change, and about 6 million show signs of cretinism. What about the significance of child mortality due to hunger? One of the most logical but pernicious misconceptions is that high mortality rates restrain population growth rates in countries with high fertility rates, and that lowering death rates will increase their population growth. On the basis of this false premise, some have suggested that resources devoted to improving child survival should be devoted to family planning. There's no doubt that a spectrum of family planning methods should be made available to all populations. Nor is there any question but that high birth rates are a major problem for countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, the Philippines, and many other developing countries. However, it is also a reality that promotion of family planning without improved nutrition, health, education, and social equity have consistently failed. India has spent more per capita on family planning than any other country and achieved essentially nothing. Egypt has had a great deal of assistance in family planning from the World Bank and USAID with meager results. By contrast, Chile, Cuba, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and other countries that have reduced their infant and preschool mortality have achieved relatively high receptor rates for family planning. Within India, the state with the lowest infant mortality and highest literacy has the lowest fertility rates, despite the fact that it is also relatively low among states in per capita income. Within Indonesia, I had an opportunity last year to compare infant mortality and family planning acceptance in the provinces with the highest and lowest infant mortality rates. Where infant mortality was lowest, Yogyakarta, most families had adopted an effective contraceptive method, and their goal was no more than 2 or 3 children. We rarely saw preschool children who were closely spaced. In the province with the highest infant mortality, few families had accepted family planning. Many wanted as many children as God would give them, and crowds of children were in evidence. The next slide shows that over a broad range of countries, the lower the infant mortality rate, here IMR, the greater the decline in birth rates between 1980 and 1988. The figures at the bottom, I know they're small, but they show an increasing infant mortality rate from left to right, and you see that the decline in birth rate is highest where infant, now this isn't birth rate, this is decline in birth rate, is highest where infant mortality is low, and it is lowest where infant mortality is high. It's clear, this is clear evidence that reducing infant deaths does not lead to higher birth rates. The 1991 UNICEF report on the state of the world's children describes the relationship between mortality 0 to 5 years of age and total fertility rates in 1960, 1980, and 1988 for 18 developing countries. There is a lag between initial steep falls in mortality and a fall in fertility rates. But as time passes and mortality rates fall further, fertility rates drop sharply. The message is that reducing the hunger that is the major factor in high mortality rates is an essential prerequisite to successful family planning. It's time to turn from the consequences of hunger and the cost of not overcoming it to an examination of what will be required to abolish hunger as a public health problem in the world. I will now review what can and must be done, beginning with iodine deficiency disorders and followed by the others. The iodine deficiency disorders are the easiest of the hidden hungers to prevent. The next slide shows the prompt drop of endemic goiter in the state of Caldas, Colombia, following the iodation of salt. Legislation requiring the iodation of all salt for human consumption need not require either government subsidy or an increase in retail price. At the time it was introduced in Guatemala, the cost of iodation was about 5 cents US per 100 pounds. It does require legislation and cooperation on the part of producers. Where there are only a few large producers and a localized group of small producers, as in the countries of Latin America, each large producer can be required to have separate iodation equipment, and the small producers can bring their salt to a common plant. Now, it's not always this easy. The rock salt used in some parts of India cannot be readily iodated in this form. In some countries, the organization of many small producers into marketing cooperatives with the capacity to handle the iodation has thus far been beyond the resources and ability of local governments. In some remote mountainous areas, iodine has been administered intramuscularly in iodinated oil. A single large dose is protective against the risk of damage to the fetus during pregnancy for up to 4 years. And recently it's been shown that similar oral doses are nearly as effective. Under some circumstances, iodation of water supplies may be feasible. Since the cause of endemic goiter is mainly the lack of iodine in local soil and water because it has been removed by heavy rainfall or glaciation, this is the one deficiency that is not amenable to a change in the use of local food supplies. Even without iodation, goiter disappears from once goitrous areas when their populations begin to consume food from non-goitrous regions or from the oceans. Vitamin A. Vitamin A deficiency should be equally easy to prevent, since green leaves and other plants are rich sources of vitamin A activity, and they're available to most populations. I will leave most of the comment on this to Dr. Underwood, but would mention that in the rubber plantation study in Indonesia, to which I referred earlier, the experimental group received a daily tablet containing iron, and the control group was to have received an identical tablet without iron. When the results were tabulated, both groups showed a return of hemoglobin status to normal and an improvement in work capacity and productivity. The explanation was that the local Nutrition Institute director, who's here, and the local representative of the World Bank that was financing the project decided to give the placebo group the negligibly small incentive of 15 rupees, then about 3 cents US per day. It could not be spent on rice because of rationing, so it was largely spent on green leaves, that is cassava, spinach, and others. And dietary analysis showed that these provided enough iron for the hemoglobin response because utilization was improved by vitamin C, vitamin A, and also the protein supplement. Now, I cite this because if the margin between sufficiency and deficiency is so narrow and so readily responsible to local foods, why is it not the obvious solution to the problem everywhere? I'll leave the answer to Dr. Underwood. Iron deficiency. The main reason that iron deficiency is not a problem among most middle and upper income populations is that their diet contains red meat as a source of heme iron that is much better absorbed than iron from vegetable diets. Moreover, these groups are less likely to have infectious diseases such as hookworm, malaria, and schistosomiasis that exacerbate iron deficiency. For less privileged populations, elimination of these diseases is a contribution to the campaign against iron deficiency. For developing country populations that are predominantly vegetarian for economic and sometimes for religious reasons, exhortation to eat more red meat is not feasible or desirable approach. Yet so low is the absorption of iron from vegetable diets that it's almost impossible for pregnant women to get sufficient iron from them. A number of reasonably well-utilized iron compounds are available for addition to staple foods, and this is an attractive approach. However, no single vehicle is applicable in all countries. In industrialized countries, infant formulas and most cereals are fortified with iron. In Egypt, the limited number of flour mills and their distribution, as well as the high bread consumption, make fortification of wheat flour attractive. In Central America, Fernando Viteri demonstrated the feasibility of fortifying sugar with iron chelate. In Indonesia, monosodium glutamate has been fortified. An approach that would link the elimination of iodine deficiency disorders to the prevention of iron deficiency would be the double fortification of salt with both iron and iodine. And this was reported at the Montreal conference last week to have been successfully field tested in India and to be ready for wider application. Now, this may be the approach that could greatly speed and facilitate the effort to overcome global iron deficiency. I must now consider how to overcome the most difficult kind of hidden hunger, that due to chronic energy and protein deficiencies. Improving food production and post-harvest food conservation, food processing and physical distribution of food are all of them important, but as I indicated in the introduction, cannot alone solve the problem of hunger. Chronic energy deficiency is largely the result of the ability of poor families to acquire enough food. The reasons for this are too complex and too controversial for me to attempt to analyze in this presentation, but they must be addressed if this kind of hunger is to be overcome. Now, there's no point in proclamations setting goals, such as the elimination of starvation and death caused by famine, the elimination of micronutrient deficiencies, preventing the damage from chronic undernutrition, as have been announced under some circumstances, unless governments are willing to take the actions required to achieve them. The World Food Congress in Rome in 1974 proved to be a rhetorical exercise that did not result in the commitment on the part of governments, including those of the industrialized countries, that would have been required to achieve the proclamation. The situation is at last changing, due both to leadership from the specialized agencies of the United Nations and private efforts. In 1978, representatives of 134 countries convened in Alma Ata and endorsed the goal of health for all by the year 2000. And by that, they meant removing the obstacles to health. But they went further and proposed a comprehensive strategy for achieving this goal that focused on prevention. And of the 9 essential elements, the first 7 were all nutrition-related. In the 1990s, WHO increased its promotion of primary health care and introduced an expanded program of immunization in cooperation with UNICEF. And this resulted in an increase in many developing countries in implementing the goals of Alma Ata. But progress was variable and somewhat disappointing. In order to accelerate and focus primary health care resources for mothers and children, UNICEF initiated a child survival initiative in 1983, originally under the acronym GOBI, that emphasized growth monitoring to determine the adequacy of child feeding, oral rehydration for severe diarrhea cases, improved personal hygiene to prevent diarrhea, and immunization to prevent common communicable diseases of childhood. Progress has since been outstanding and promises a genuine child survival and development revolution. So just one example, the result of the UNICEF WHO expanded program of immunization, with coverage rates going to 80 to 90% in country after country where originally they'd been less than 20%. Oral rehydration against diarrhea has been introduced with comparable success in many countries. Clean water has been made available to an additional 900 million persons. 4/5 of the world population falls within 17 countries in which contraceptive use has risen above 50%. But the direct attack on hidden hunger has proved more difficult. UNICEF in September of 1990 brought together 71 presidents and prime ministers for the first World Summit on Children. And this largest gathering of heads of states and government in history made an extraordinary new commitment, the decision to try to end child deaths and child malnutrition on today's scale by the year 2000. I'm not going to be able to discuss the results in detail, but last week in Montreal, a policy conference on micronutrient malnutrition was convened by WHO and UNICEF with the participation of other agencies in the UN system and bilateral agencies concerned with nutrition and delegates from more than 60 developing countries. The consensus of over 300 participants was that the goal of eliminating deficiencies of vitamin A, iodine, and iron in the current decade will be achieved if current resource flows are maintained, and if current leadership is sustained, and if countries keep the commitment their leaders made at the World Summit. Intensive preparations are now underway for an international conference of nutrition in Rome in December of 1991. Building on the Summit for Children and the Conference on Micronutrients, it should be another landmark in the conquest of hunger that now not just should, but can be achieved. In closing, a word about our obligation to the human future. This lecture is focused on freedom from hunger, both hidden and overt, as the most fundamental of human rights There are also very real problems of environmental pollution and destruction, global learning, loss of germplasm, and the rate of human reproduction that exacerbates all of these. Conquering hunger will release human potential for creating better societies. However, achieving the other rights of shelter, education, and hope for the future will not follow automatically unless governments implement appropriate policies. While the reduction in child mortality that follows the alleviation of hunger is a prerequisite, successful fertility reduction also requires education, economic opportunity, and a potential advantage of having fewer children. Success in lowering and eventually stabilizing population growth is essential to the permanent solution of all of the other problems, including pressure on the environment, food supply, global warming and war. The physical, biological, and social problems faced by humankind are caused by human activity, and they can be solved by human actions if we avoid further delay. Everyone concerned with the human food chain, from production to consumption, whose collaborative efforts are recognized by the World Food Prize, have their own formidable tasks. But they must also be effective partners in the efforts of other disciplines to assure the future of human society in a sustainable environment in which it can flourish at its best. And now, really finally, in the words of Gabriel Mistral, many things we need can wait. The child cannot. Right now is the time his bones are being formed, his blood is being made, and his senses are being developed. To him, we cannot answer tomorrow. His name is today. Let us remove the ball and chain of hunger from the children of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nevin. That was riveting and surprisingly well prepared, Nevin. I didn't mean that. That was tremendous. I think, although we are due for a break at 10 o'clock, I do think we should take this opportunity with this tremendous individual in our midst to give him a few questions. Perhaps while Pat is soliciting the cards, perhaps you could come up here, Nevin, and perhaps I could ask you a question.
I was afraid of that.
I wonder, would you care to comment on the impact that the changing political scene, particularly in the USSR and Eastern Europe, might have on the problem of hunger and on the availability of food worldwide?
Well, I think it's evident that it's going to have a double effect. The immediate food and nutrition, environmental, economic, and other problems of Eastern Europe are obviously overwhelming. And they are going to divert from the other industrialized countries resources that might have gone to the developing ones. And this might be interpreted as a negative effect, but on the other hand, the reduction in tensions, the reduction we've already seen in military, and that is certainly going to continue throughout the industrialized countries should release additional resources and should make it easier for many countries to redirect their priorities. So I'm not just hopeful, but I think confident that the net effect will be very positive. And I must say that in the conference in Montreal last week, I didn't sense any negative impact on the very substantial resource flows. I had to cut that part out of my talk, but the resource flows that are going from the World Bank, the World Food Program, bilateral aid into the micronutrient initiative, and in general to the child survival strategies of UNICEF and WHO are very substantial. And if they're well directed, and there is the political cooperation within the countries, then they should do the job. I tried to give you the feeling that we've passed the point where we say we should do this and we should do that. I think we've reached the point where we're confident that we can.
Thank you, Nevin. There are a number of related questions here, not all we will have time to ask you. One questioner asks, please comment a bit more on the prognosis for the United Nations programs in addressing the nutritional problems you have described. What particularly is the greatest hazard facing the resolve of the World Summit in New York?
Well, I partially answered that, but the greatest hazard is that many governments still continue to be disinterested in the welfare of their people and interested in the welfare of the governed, of the ones who are doing the governing and who are behind the government. So that, and then another hazard is that some governments just don't have the competence and the leadership to respond. And so progress will continue to be, I think, remarkable in Southeast Asia. And the potential for progress in most of Latin America. But there are going to be individual countries in Africa and in Burma that are going to be left out initially, despite the best efforts of everyone, international, bilateral, voluntary agencies, for the reasons I've indicated.
Thank you, Nevin. Here's a nice political question. In relation to hidden hunger, please evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of President Bush's New World Order. In your opinion, is the so-called free enterprise system capable of overcoming hidden hunger? If yes, please give some examples of success stories in the developing world. There's a challenge for you, Nevin.
Well, first of all, I haven't the faintest idea what the New World Order means. Secondly, this administration and recent ones, if they are representative of a free enterprise system, have neglected their duties toward their people compared with other countries that are also representative of free enterprise system, but have paid more attention to, particularly to their women and children. I heard Terry Bradshaw on, I think it was ABC the other morning, saying that the U.S. has the worst record of concern for mothers and children. Certainly, the the safety net that we provide is not only less than the safety net of any European country or any other industrialized country, but less than many developing countries. And consequently, some of our statistics are more comparable to those of developing countries. But I don't think this has anything to do with the free enterprise system. I think that you have to have a government that cares about a program such as WIC for mothers and children and sees that it achieves the coverage which is intended. A program, the stamp plans, the food stamps, which reach even the people that are defined beneficiaries. It simply doesn't reach them. And then when it comes to legislation to protect the nursing mother, or when it comes to the maintenance of daycare centers for the working women, we're simply far behind other free enterprise countries. And immunization, I couldn't believe 2 years ago when I was in Egypt they had achieved 90% coverage, and I really believe it because the population is compressed along a very long and narrow area and accessible to health centers. There was a massive television campaign. But 5 years before, I wouldn't have believed that Egypt would achieve 20% immunization, 90% coverage of immunization of young children. What do we have in the United States? We have measles epidemics. We have whooping cough epidemics. We have neglected the immunization of our children in a way that no other industrialized and few developing countries in the world today have neglected it. And it was almost, it was a paradox to be there in the summit in Montreal and hear of the progress in country after country of the degree of immunization and know what was happening in the United States. So this hasn't got anything to do with free enterprise. It has to do with the compassion of governments. And if you think that this depends on economic prosperity, take a look at some of the poor countries, and I've already mentioned Costa Rica, which with a very low per capita income have achieved a social equity that gives them better statistics than we have for our minority groups.
I thought that'd get you fired up, Nevin. You can see how exciting 25 years of working with Nevin has been. I think perhaps in view of the time, we'll terminate the discussion period now. Once again, Nevin, we would like to thank you for that beautiful address, and once again, once again, we congratulate you on this very significant and justly deserved recognition. We will break and return at about 10:30, Provost Swan, and we will then get into further detail in certain of the areas that Nevin covered in his presentation. Areas that Professor Scrimshaw covered in his masterful overview. Each speaker has been asked to take no more than 30 minutes of formal presentation so that we do have an opportunity to ask these experts, while we have them with us, questions that might emerge as a consequence of their presentations. Before I call upon the first of the experts, may I have the first slide? And I'd like each of these experts to pay particular attention to this slide. It's a quote attributable to Napoleon I, who said, "Go, sir, gallop, and don't forget that the world was made in 6 days. You can ask me for anything you like except time." Just bear that in mind, Barbara. It is my privilege to introduce Barbara Underwood, who is Assistant Director for International Program Activities for the National Eye Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Barbara has made major contributions in the area of vitamin A nutrition, and she has developed means and techniques for evaluating vitamin A status of populations in the field. It gives me great pleasure to ask you to come forth, Barbara, and to discuss for us the consequences of avitaminosis A.
President Jiski, Dean Swan, Mr. Ruan, our honored 1991 World Food Prize laureate, my mentor also, my colleague, and my friend, Nevin Scrimshaw. Dr. Young, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very distinct honor for me to be asked to participate in this symposium in honor of Dr. Scrimshaw. As one of the vice presidents of the International Union of Nutrition Science, on behalf of their council who met just 2 weeks ago in Heidelberg, Germany, and who represent the nutrition scientists worldwide, I've been asked to convey their congratulations and pride that you have received this distinguished honor, which you have so well deserved. I have learned this morning from Dr. Scrimshaw's presentation, as I always learn when I sit and listen to him, and I feel very humbled at having to follow such a marvelous presentation. But I do want to try to expand on some of his comments on the consequences of hidden hunger in the form of avitaminosis A, or hypovitaminosis A. May I have the first slide, please? This is not hidden hunger. It's the irreversible blindness due to vitamin A deficiency. And this is not a slide I took 10 or 15 years ago. This is a picture of a child that I took less than a month ago in Thailand. This child is but one of some 350,000 children who are estimated to go blind every year from severe vitamin A deficiency. Out of the 500,000 new cases that occur of total blindness in children, 350,000 of them, 70%, are due, we believe, to vitamin A deficiency. But you know, after a year, there are only about 100,000 of them left because 70% of these children die within the first year of becoming blind. So we only have about 100,000 living at the end of a year. And when you look at the worldwide statistics on the causes of blindness, xerophthalmia represents only about 4 to 5% of the total out of the 27 to 35 million blind people in the world today. But this far underestimates, you see, the real consequences of severe vitamin A deficiency because of this very high mortality rate that occurs, leaving few of these children to grow up and to be counted among the adult blind in the world. This is not hidden hunger either, nor this. These are milder signs of vitamin A deficiency. These signs can be reversed in a matter of just a few days by as little as 4 to 5 cents worth of vitamin A. But because that 4 to 5% of the total blind does not appear to be competitive with other causes of blindness in the world, too often the problem of vitamin A deficiency does not rouse public concern to the same level for doing something about it. But these milder forms of eye disease affect some 5 to 6 million, I'm not sure whether there's a pointer here, I guess not. About 5 to 6, it's the middle bar here, of the children in the world today with mild clinical vitamin A deficiency.
What are you looking for, Barbara?
A pointer. Right, that's all right.
Excuse me, I'll go and get
No,
one.
that's all right. But what about these children? And by the way, Dr. Scrimshaw, I took this picture almost 30 years ago when you were visiting me in Pakistan, and I was a young PhD graduate, eager, doing my first significant field work, and you came on an advisory group to help me in those early days in my career development. And I wanted to acknowledge this, how meaningful that Dr. Scrimshaw has been in my own development in my career. But this is a picture of the hidden hunger we're talking about today. These are 2 Pakistani children, both 18 months of age. One from an environment of a relatively wealthy home, the other from a deprived environment. Here are 2 children from the Dominican Republic, both 5 years of age. This is a hidden hunger that we're talking about today, and it affects, its effects you often do not realize until you put on a growth chart the development achievement of those children and see how far off the norm they fall. And too frequently, people coming into these situations don't realize that. They don't realize the extent of stunning that we see in the child population around the world. Now, these children are suffering from multiple nutrient deficits. Protein energy malnutrition, usually iron, a mix of other micronutrients, of which vitamin A is one, iodine may be one, zinc may be one, but they so often go unnoticed. The hidden hunger. In the case of hypovitaminosis A, those first slides I showed you with clinical eye signs represent the tip of the iceberg. This hidden hunger, where you do not see clinical eye signs, we estimate now, based on newer techniques for measuring marginal vitamin A deficiency, probably affect up to 40 to 60 million more preschool-aged children in the world. Why are we concerned about this? They don't have clinical eye signs. They're not in immediate danger of going blind, although they can develop the clinical symptoms very quickly if they get an infection or something. But of recent data has shown that these children not only those who have clinical eye signs, but the ones who are marginally deficient, subclinically deficient, are dying at least twice the rate of children who do not have underlying vitamin A deficiency. This graph shows you the results, the cumulative mortality that we experienced in a clinical mass trial that we conducted in southern India very recently. The lower line was the cumulative deaths of children who had received vitamin A weekly in an amount that simulated the recommended dietary allowance, an amount you can get in food, versus the upper line, which was the cumulative mortality amongst a control population who didn't receive a regular supply of vitamin A. There was over a 50% reduction in the risk of these children dying when they got a common childhood infection, measles, upper respiratory or lower respiratory infection, diarrhea. And this is only one study. There have been other studies that Dr. Scrimshaw referred to in his talk that have been completed now, that have also shown, using a little different approach than this, a periodic distribution of high-dose vitamin A, also can have, under some circumstances, a substantial effect in reducing mortality. There's a study that has very recently been published from Sirlahi, Nepal, in which a 30% reduction in risk of mortality is reported. Another study that has not yet been reported, but was done in Jumla, Nepal, in which there was, again, a 30% reduction. There have been studies from Indonesia previously suggesting at least a 30% reduction. One study in Indonesia, which Dr. Darwin Karyadi, who is here in the audience, was involved with, in which fortified monosodium glutamate was used, showed a reduction of 45% risk. I said in some circumstances this has been demonstrated because there are some other studies, also some not reported yet, that have not been able to show as substantial a reduction in mortality as these other studies. And we recently had a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, to try to understand a little better why we were seeing variations in the outcome from giving vitamin A to these marginally subclinically deficient children. And it was acknowledged that we really can't expect every circumstance to be one that would respond to this. But the investigators present in that meeting felt very strongly that there was no reason to not move aggressively ahead to try to improve vitamin A nutriture in all populations of children where the intake was inadequate, because there are health benefits, even though they may not all be of the same dramatic magnitude as has been shown in some of those studies. But as I mentioned, vitamin A deficiency seldom occurs in isolation. It occurs within a context as a public health problem of deprivation. Vernon didn't come back with my pointer here.
I did, Barbara, but we have to wait till the next speaker to get the pointer.
Okay, well, we'll do what we can. It occurs within a context of deprivation, both when you look at it at the country level, the macro environment, as I've called it here, where you have marginal lands able to grow adequate food, and where you have, in many situations, archaic types of social and political. I don't know that you can focus that a little better. Archaic social and political systems that influence the food supply and its distribution to the microenvironment or the community level, where again you have these ecologic, social, and economic factors that are all contributing not only to an inadequate diet, but to the exposure to infections that together work synergistically, as Dr. Scrimshaw alluded to, in producing what we see, and I've called here the face of malnutrition. Now, I present this slide to you because I don't feel that there's a magic bullet solution to the problem of vitamin A deficiency, that all of our solutions must realize the context in which it occurs and seek the best solution to this problem within the context of the local situation. If we are going to obtain solutions that are sustainable, we often think, is this a medical problem or is it a problem of development? I would suggest it's not one or the other. When you have the problem that the first slides I showed you suggest of a clinical problem, that's a medical emergency, and it requires a availability of a high-dose vitamin A capsule immediately. Where you do not have that degree of severity of vitamin A deficiency, you have the context I showed in the last slide. That's more of a development issue, and one must think about the sustainability within that context of any intervention program that is introduced. If we look at the macro level, this slide is one that Dr. Scrimshaw showed of the distribution as of 1987 of countries thought to have a clinical problem of vitamin A deficiency. Now, this map is based on clinical signs. With the information we now have of the importance of subclinical vitamin A deficiency, this map is outdated. There were some 37 countries designated here as having a problem. But if we updated this map based on subclinical vitamin A deficiency, I'm sure it would look very differently, that there would be many other countries designated as having a public health problem, because where some of the newer techniques for detecting marginal vitamin A deficiency, some of which have been refined right here at Iowa State in Dr. Olson's laboratory. Application of some of those techniques are now suggesting that 40 to up to 60% of preschool children may be marginally malnourished in many of the developing countries. So this map is very much outdated. Vitamin A depletion, if we take it from that big map of the world down to a more community level, generally occurs within this deprivation syndrome, where you have the problem of illiteracy and undereducation of women especially, that often leads to social isolation. So that even when we have intervention programs in this context, these women we are most interested in reaching often do not take advantage because of their lack of education and illiteracy. It's a social situation where you have poor personal hygiene habits, and these perpetuate this vicious cycle of infections and further depletion in the nutritional condition, including vitamin A. Where you have traditional practices that prevail, that govern child rearing and child feeding practices to children as well as to pregnant and lactating mothers, and where large family sizes superimposed on the economic situation of poverty lead to overcrowding, and such homes where underemployment and unemployment limit incomes available to meet many needs. Food for the children is only one of them, and often this problem is occurring where you have infertile, arid land where water is a big problem, not only for the growing of food, but for maintaining personal and environmental hygiene and sanitation. So this is a complex issue. Vitamin A deficiency as a public health problem occurs in this complex context of deprivation. When one looks at the individual, then, vitamin A deficiency characteristically occurs in preschool-aged children who suffer frequent diarrheal, respiratory, and other infections that create a vicious cycle downward, decreasing their appetite and promoting inefficient utilization of nutrients that leads to chronic malnutrition, blinding malnutrition, and very frequently death. Now, vitamin A deficiency can occur at any age, but preschool years, the 1 to 6 year old, is most frequently at risk of serious health consequences. And the younger the age, between 1 and 3 particularly, most at risk of blindness and death. Why is this true? Breastfeeding is protective against the clinical signs of vitamin A deficiency. And in populations where breastfeeding practices predominate throughout the first year of life, even from malnourished mothers, you seldom see clinical evidence of vitamin A deficiency. But that can be a little deceiving because the breast milk of a malnourished mother may not have sufficient vitamin A to build up the reserves of the infant. It's enough to meet the clinical need, the need to prevent clinical signs, but it may not build up sufficient to get the reserves in the liver build up. And this is because during this period of weaning, usually starting around 4 to 6 months, till full weaning that may occur at the end of the year or in some populations 18 months or longer, the complementary food given to the diet of the infant seldom contains sources of vitamin A. We need to focus our attention on this fact as we think about intervention programs to prevent this problem of occurring. The importance of education of mothers in child feeding during this complementary food period before weaning has occurred to build up the reserves of the infants before they go into the fully weaned stage. When we do not have that occurring, and this is a picture, Dr. Karyadi, of an Indonesian infant that I took several years ago. This infant was weaned early and onto a condensed milk diet and was blind before 1 year of age. Some of the children I just saw in South Thailand were weaned early because mothers were poor and they had to go to work and they didn't have a recourse. They weaned onto condensed milks that were not fortified with vitamin A, and I saw children blind as early as 3 months of age under those conditions. This is one of them that I took just less than a month ago. On the other hand, very frequently in these conditions of poverty, the sources of vitamin A activity are in the family pot. They're in the diets of the older children and adults. But what happens so often during this weaned period is that the white part of that family pot is fed to the child. And the green part, the leaves that have the vitamin A activity, frequently are, for cultural and other reasons, not given to this child. This is a problem of education. In such circumstances, one does not need to introduce high-dose capsules of vitamin A. One needs to focus on a better utilization of the resources that are already there and in the home, which, by the way, will deal with the other micronutrient deficiencies, as well as vitamin A in the food. It's that approach that we need to counteract the hidden hunger. Here's that 5-year-old stunted child that I showed you in an earlier slide, together with a 2-year-old child from the Dominican Republic. What this child needs is food, a good diversified diet that will meet not only the needs for vitamin A, but for iron, for protein, for energy, and the other micronutrients. The high-dose capsule that you see here that is used and distributed widely by UNICEF is a most important component of our overall strategy to prevent vitamin A deficiency in the developing world. It's a very important part of it, and it needs to be available in all the medical institutions for treating vitamin A deficiency. On the other hand, we must not think of it as a magic bullet, because we have these underlying causes that are contributing to the problem of vitamin A deficiency and that must be addressed if we are going to have a sustainable solution to this problem. The problems of insufficient household food security, inadequate maternal and child care, insufficient health services, and unhealthy environments. These are also things that we can do something about and should be a part of the overall strategy for relieving micronutrient deficiency as well as macronutrient deficiencies in the developing world in a sustainable way. I just would point out to you that there are certain parts of the world where there have not been, where in the past there were very significant problems of vitamin A deficiency which have disappeared without any special programs for vitamin A. And this has occurred in such countries as Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, where economic progress has, and for the most part of most of Thailand, economic progress has relieved some of the problems of poverty, and the foods were there and people were able to obtain it. But it's also disappeared in Costa Rica and in China, where a more equitable distribution of resources have occurred. So you see, part of the relief of this problem is indeed a problem of development. But there are many countries on this map where we can't wait for development to solve the problem. It's there now, it needs more urgent solutions, and we have a number of intervention approaches that may be considered by countries depending upon the context in which the problem occurs in their particular country. One of the things that we need most is an increased awareness of these social and biologic consequences of the hidden hunger from hypovitaminosis A that I have spoken of earlier. And one of the successes, I think, of the conference in Montreal last week that Dr. Scrimshaw referred to was to raise up the awareness of policymakers as to the significance of this problem. But it needs to go beyond policymakers. It needs to get to program managers, field staff, general populations, as well as the target population that we are trying to reach. There, secondly, is an extremely important need to get good, appropriate nutrition and health education messages out. Now, in the past, people have said to me, oh, look, nutrition education doesn't work. We've been doing it for years, and indeed we have. But we've been doing it by methods and approaches that have not really been appropriate to local situations.